Here is the thing about working the night shift at a hotel front desk. Nobody sees you. Not the guests who check in half asleep and shuffle to their rooms without making eye contact. Not the housekeeping crew who don't arrive until the morning light starts bleeding through the lobby windows. And definitely not the managers who exist somewhere in the warm, comfortable world of daytime where things like performance reviews and first impressions happen. The night shift is its own sealed environment. Two people, a lobby that smells like industrial carpet cleaner, and the ghost of 1,000 complimentary breakfasts. A clock on the wall that seems to move backwards between 2 and 4 in the morning, and absolutely nowhere to hide from each other. I need you to remember that setup, because it matters. Because on the morning this story ends, there were 3 people standing in that lobby. Me, my coworker Eric, and our morning manager Sandra, who had just walked in with her travel mug and her clipboard and the particular expression of someone who already suspects today is going to be a problem. Sandra opened the door to the breakfast area. She walked to the small back-of-house refrigerator where the waffle batter should have been sitting, thawed and ready for the breakfast attendant. She opened it, she looked inside, and then she walked back out into the lobby with that clipboard held flat against her chest, and she looked directly at Eric. "I thought," she said, in the careful, even tone of someone who has decided not to raise her voice, "that you said you always double-checked behind her." The lobby got very quiet, and Eric, for the first time in 8 months I had worked alongside him, had absolutely nothing to say. That moment took 3 weeks to arrive, and it started, the way most slow disasters do, with something so small you almost don't notice it happening. The Beaumont Suites was not a large hotel. 83 rooms, 2 floors, a lobby that peaked in ambition around 2009 and had been coasting on that momentum ever since. We had a breakfast nook with 4 tables, a waffle iron that required a ritual of specific steps to operate correctly, and a coffee station that guests treated as though it owed them something personal. Night shift ran from 11 at night to 7 in the morning. The team was exactly 2 people, whoever drew the short straw and Eric. I had been there about 3 months when I started to understand Eric's system. He was not lazy in the obvious way. He didn't sleep in the back office or disappear for 2-hour stretches. He was present. He was visible. He was, in fact, quite good at the specific performance of appearing busy without the burden of actually doing the work that needed doing. The way it worked was elegant, in a depressing sort of way. The tasks on night shift fell into 2 categories. There were the visible tasks, the ones that produced a legible outcome that someone else could see and comment on, folding the lobby blankets, printing the next day's check-in report, setting the continental breakfast layouts of the baskets and the fruit and the little individual cream cheese packets were arranged with care. And then there were the invisible tasks, the ones that had to happen or things broke, but that nobody ever looked at directly. Restocking the keycard supply behind the desk, wiping down the coffee station, which acquired a specific kind of grime after midnight that I don't want to describe in detail, but that I thought about constantly, taking the trash from the side hallway, and most critically, pulling the frozen waffle batter containers from the back freezer at around 5 in the morning so they would be fully thawed and usable when the breakfast attendant arrived at 6:30. Eric had a finely tuned sensor for the difference between these 2 categories. If a task was visible, he was on it. If a task was invisible, it became through some quiet gravitational process mine. I want to be fair. In the beginning, I didn't resent it much. I had worked service jobs before. The distribution of labor is never perfectly equal, and I was new, and I told myself I was still learning the rhythm of the place. So I did the invisible work. I wiped the coffee station, I restocked the key cards, I checked the side hallway, and every shift at around 5 past 5 in the morning, I would look over at Eric and say something like, "Hey, don't forget to pull the waffle batter," and Eric would nod and say, "Oh, right, yeah," and then he would pull it. This is important. The reminder was mine. The pulling technically was his, but the act only happened because I initiated it. And this distinction is exactly where the problem lived. because when Sandra came in at 7, or when the morning manager on alternating weeks, a man named Phil who smelled like cedar and chronic disappointment, arrived to start the handoff, Eric was the one standing at the desk with a rundown of what had been accomplished. He did it with such practiced ease that I didn't understand for a long time what was happening. "Breakfast is all set, batter's been pulled, lobby's clean," he'd say, ticking things off in the tone of someone summarizing a productive night. And the morning manager would nod and make a note, and I would be somewhere in the background, refilling the paper in the printer, invisible. I noticed, but I told myself it was small. I told myself that reasonable people understand that in a two-person operation, the credit flows equally, even when the labor doesn't. I told myself a lot of things that, looking back, were mostly just ways of not having an uncomfortable conversation with a coworker I had to spend 8 hours a night with. The coffee station grime kept accumulating. I kept cleaning it. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes not from overwork, but from watching someone else take credit for your overwork. It doesn't hit you all at once. It builds in layers, quiet and compressive, until one morning you're wiping down a surface at 3:45 in the morning and you realize that you are angry in a way that has been there for weeks without you naming it. I was at that point somewhere around month 5. But here is where I made a mistake that I didn't understand was a mistake until it was too late. I kept reminding Eric about the waffle batter, not out of generosity, out of self-protection, because if the batter wasn't pulled, the waffle attendant, a woman named Rosa who had strong opinions and a very efficient way of expressing them, would come in at 6:30 to a frozen block of nothing and would report it to whoever was available to report it to. And both of you were on night shift was not a distinction that management seemed interested in making in those moments. So I reminded Eric, every shift, 5 past 5 like a clock, and Eric pulled the batter, and Eric mentioned the batter in the morning handoff, and the waffle iron produced waffles, and everything was fine. Until the morning, Eric decided to volunteer to Sandra that I was the one who was forgetful about closing tasks. I want to tell you exactly how that conversation was described to me, because I wasn't there for it. I was in the back, running the end-of-shift checkout report, when Eric had what I can only describe as a strategic little chat with Sandra at the front desk. I found out about it from Rosa, who had come in early that morning and overheard the tail end of it while she was getting the coffee going. She pulled me aside near the supply closet and told me in a low, careful voice that Eric had been talking to Sandra about how sometimes I miss things on the closing list, that he had framed it gently, helpfully even, as something he'd been quietly picking up the slack on, that he had used the word forgetful. Rosa looked at me with the flat, patient expression of someone who has seen this movie before in several different workplaces and is reporting the plot out of professional courtesy. "I thought you should know," she said, and then she went to set up her station. I stood in that supply closet for a moment. I looked at the shelf of complimentary shampoo bottles. I thought about the coffee station. I thought about the key cards. I thought about 5 past 5 every single shift, my voice in the air. "Hey, don't forget to pull the waffle batter," and Eric's nod, and Eric's hands pulling it out of the freezer, and Eric's voice in the morning handoff. "Batter's been pulled." I thought, okay. That was all. Just okay. I walked back to the desk. I finished the checkout report. I did not say anything to Eric. I did not confront Sandra. I waited until my shift ended, and I drove home, and I lay in bed looking at the ceiling, and I thought about what I was going to do. The answer came quickly. It was not dramatic. It was not complicated. It was just the removal of one small thing. I was going to stop reminding him. Let me describe what it actually costs to decide to do nothing. There's a version of this story where the decision feels triumphant from the first moment, where you picture the inevitable outcome with satisfaction and drift into a comfortable sleep. That is not quite what happened. What actually happened is that I went into my next shift knowing I was going to withhold a reminder, and I spent the first 4 hours of that shift in a low, grinding state of waiting. Partly, it was practical anxiety. If the batter didn't get pulled, Rosa reported it, management noted it, and my name was attached to the shift the same as Eric's. The fact that Eric had been taking the credit did not mean I would escape the blame. But partly, it was something harder to articulate. There is a kind of muscle memory that develops in any working relationship, even a bad one. The ritual of the 5 past 5 reminder had become automatic. Letting it go felt strange in my body, the way skipping a step in a habitual sequence feels strange, like reaching for a light switch in the dark and finding only wall. Eric was at his usual station when 5 o'clock arrived. He was behind the desk, looking at his phone, which was his primary occupation between the hours of 2 and 6 in the morning. I was doing the final check on the lobby, straightening the brochure rack, which nobody had touched all night, but which I straightened anyway because that is the kind of person I am. 5 past 5 came. I did not say anything. 5:15. I was at the desk, entering a note in the system. Eric was still at his phone. The freezer, in the back room behind the breakfast area, remained closed. 5:30. The night was in its final stretch. The particular quality of the air changes in a hotel lobby at 5:30 in the morning. The heating system kicks into a different cycle. The darkness outside starts to take on a slightly lighter shade of nothing. Guests who have early flights begin appearing in the elevator, trailing roll-aboard bags, looking dazed and purposeful at the same time. I checked 2 people out. I printed receipts. I kept my eyes on my work. Eric did not go to the freezer. At 6:15, Sandra's car pulled into the parking lot. I watched the headlights through the lobby windows. Eric saw them too and began his morning routine, which consisted of arranging his expression into the composed look of a person who had been professionally productive all night. Sandra came in. She set her travel mug on the edge of the desk. She asked how the night had been. Eric gave his rundown. Lobby, fine. Check-ins, 2 late arrivals, both smooth. Closing list, handled. He did not mention the waffle batter. He did not mention it because it had not been pulled, and he did not mention it the way you don't mention a thing you are hoping nobody will notice. Rosa arrived at 6:30 exactly. I heard her go into the breakfast area. I heard the small refrigerator open. I heard it close. I counted to about 4. Sandra? Rosa appeared in the doorway. Batter's still frozen. Sandra looked at the refrigerator door from across the room like it had personally inconvenienced her. Then she looked at Eric. Then she looked at me. What happened with the batter? Eric opened his mouth. I thought she was getting that part. I looked at him. It's a shared task. It's on the closing list. Sandra looked at the closing list on the clipboard. She made a note. It wasn't a big moment. Nobody raised their voice. Rosa went back to her station to figure out a workaround. Sandra moved on. The shift ended. I drove home. But something had shifted because now there was a note on the clipboard. The second shift, Eric remembered the waffle batter. He pulled it himself without a word from me at 5:20. I watched him do it from the corner of my eye while pretending to check the keycard stock. He said nothing about it. I said nothing about it. The batter thawed, Rosa made waffles, Sandra made no notes. I thought, one time proves nothing. The third shift, Eric was tired. He had mentioned at the start of the night that he had trouble sleeping, that his schedule was thrown off, that he was running on maybe 4 hours. This is the kind of information coworkers share, not because it is relevant to the work, but because it is a preemptive excuse, a cushion laid out early in case it becomes necessary later. I noted it. I said nothing. At 5 past 5, Eric was in his chair with his chin resting on his hand, doing the slow blink of a person negotiating with consciousness. I was at the printer. The freezer waited in the back. I finished what I was doing at the printer. I walked back to the desk. I began entering the morning log. 5:15, 5:20, 5:30. I checked out a guest with a flight at 7. She asked if there was anywhere nearby to get breakfast, and I gave her 2 options within a mile. She thanked me and left. The door swung shut. The lobby was quiet. At 5:40, Eric's eyes closed for about 10 seconds. He caught himself, sat up straighter, looked at his phone. At 6, I heard Sandra's car. The morning handoff happened the same way it always did. Eric gave his rundown. His voice was a little slower than usual, a little rougher, but he gave the rundown. Lobby, fine. Late checkout requested by room 214, noted in the system. Closing list, handled. He did not go to the freezer. I am going to tell you something honest. Standing there in that lobby, watching Eric deliver his summary with the easy confidence of a man who had no idea what he had not done, I felt a very specific kind of calm. Not satisfaction, not yet, just a clear, settled understanding that the architecture of what was about to happen had been built correctly, and that all it needed now was gravity. Rosa was 7 minutes late that morning. I know because I watched the clock. She came in moving fast, unwinding her scarf, apologizing as she pushed into the breakfast area. I heard the small refrigerator open. A pause, longer than the first time. Then Rosa came back out. "It's frozen again," she said. This time her voice was not a report, it was a verdict. Sandra set down her travel mug. She did not look at it. She looked at the refrigerator, she looked at Rosa, she looked at the closing list on the clipboard, and she ran her finger down it until she reached the entry for breakfast setup, which had been checked off. Then she looked at Eric. Then she looked at me. There is a version of this moment where I felt nervous, where I scrambled to explain myself, to separate my name from the situation before I could attach. But I had been preparing for this in a quiet, patient way for 3 shifts, and what I actually felt was very close to still. "What happened with the batter?" Sandra asked. Eric straightened in his chair. The sleep had gone out of his posture, replaced with the alert energy of someone recalibrating quickly. "I think there might have been a miscommunication," he said. "I assumed she was handling that portion of the setup." "She assumed I was handling it," I said. I kept my voice neutral, not defensive, not pointed, just accurate. "It's a shared task. It's been on the list the same way every shift." Sandra looked at the clipboard again. "This is the second time in 4 shifts." "I know," I said. Sandra turned back to Eric, and here is where the moment arrived. Here is the sentence that had been building for weeks, through every 5 past 5 reminder I had given, and every morning handoff where the credit had flowed the wrong direction. Sandra tilted her head slightly, the way people do when they are about to say something they have been waiting to say. "Eric," she said, "you told me last week that you always double-checked behind her on the closing tasks." The lobby was very quiet. I want to describe what happened to Eric's face in that moment, because it was instructive. He didn't go pale exactly. It was more that a particular quality of ease, the practiced ease of someone who has said the right thing in the right room for a long time, just drained out of him quietly, the way heat leaves a room when a window is left open. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He opened it again. "I do check," he said. "I thought I had. The batter's frozen. This is the second time. I've been running on very little sleep. I mentioned that at the start of shift." Sandra looked at him for a moment without expression. "I appreciate that, but this is a task that affects the morning team. Rosa has a full breakfast to set up, and she's working around a frozen block right now." From the breakfast area, there was the particular sound of Rosa making something work that was not supposed to work, which is a sound that communicates more than words usually can. Sandra made a note on the clipboard. She said she would be following up with both of us by the end of the week, that she wanted the breakfast setup process documented more explicitly, and that she expected it to be reliable. She said this in the tone of someone closing a meeting, not delivering a punishment, and then she went to help Rosa figure out the waffle situation. I started gathering my things for end of shift. Jacket, keys, the small notebook I kept in the desk drawer. Eric was at the other end of the desk, very quiet. After a moment, he said, "You could have reminded me." I looked at him. "I told Sandra I was forgetful about closing tasks and that you caught things behind me." He didn't say anything. "You've been pulling that batter because I reminded you every shift at 5 past 5. I stopped reminding you." Another pause, a long one. Outside, the sun was in the process of actually arriving, which it does slowly and without drama in November, the sky going from black to a flat gray blue that is not quite dawn and not quite morning, but something administrative in between. "I didn't think you knew about that," Eric said finally. He meant the conversation with Sandra. "I told Rosa." He nodded. He seemed to be doing a kind of internal accounting, the quiet recalculation that happens when a system you have been operating quietly gets its actual parameters exposed. He did not apologize. I did not expect him to, but there was something different in the way he was sitting at the end of that desk. Something that was structural about his posture for 8 months was gone, and what replaced it was more ordinary, more human, and considerably less confident.
I clocked out. I drove home in the gray morning light with the heater on and the radio playing something I don't remember, and I felt, if not triumphant, then something close to resolved.
What happened after is less dramatic than the moment in the lobby, but in some ways it is the more interesting part of the story. Sandra did follow up. She sent a message to both of us 2 days later outlining the expectations for the breakfast setup task, with specific times attached. Pull frozen items no later than 5:15, confirm with a note in the system, both names on the task. She had apparently gone back through the system logs and could see which entries had been made when, which meant she had a reasonable picture of who had been doing what on nights when both names were supposedly covering the same task. I don't know exactly what that picture showed her. She didn't share it in detail, but the follow-up message had a specific quality of having been written by someone who had looked at a pattern and drawn a conclusion and decided to address the conclusion through policy rather than confrontation. Eric got very focused on the breakfast setup after that, not in a performative way, which surprised me slightly. He didn't make a show of pulling the batter early or narrate it for my benefit. He just did it. At 5:10 or 5:15, he would go to the back, I would hear the freezer open, he would come back. No announcement. He also, and this happened more gradually, started doing some of the invisible work. Not all of it, not in a way that would qualify as transformation, but the coffee station started getting wiped down without me doing it every single time. The key card stock started getting checked by someone other than me. One night, I came back from a guest call to find the side hallway trash bag replaced, which had never happened without me doing it first. Neither of us talked about any of this directly. There is a kind of workplace renegotiation that happens without language through the quiet redistribution of tasks over time that is in some ways more durable than any confrontation. Confrontations produce defensiveness, and defensiveness produces its own distortions. What happened between me and Eric was closer to a recalibration. He had operated under a set of assumptions about what he could get away with and who was watching. One morning, with a single question from Sandra, those assumptions were recalibrated, and the system that had existed in the space of those assumptions quietly restructured itself. By month 8, which was about 3 months after the waffle batter incident, the night shift had a different quality. Not warm, exactly. Eric and I were never going to be friends in any meaningful sense, and we both seemed to understand that and be fine with it. But the particular dynamic where I was invisible and he was legible had stopped functioning. Morning handoffs were more accurate. The closing list represented something closer to reality, and when Sandra came in, she looked at both of us with the same neutral attention, rather than defaulting to one of us as the authoritative source of what the night had been. I stayed at that hotel for another 4 months before I moved to a job that kept daytime hours and didn't require me to develop a relationship with industrial carpet cleaner. I didn't make a big exit. I gave my notice, worked my last few shifts, and on my final morning I shook Sandra's hand and said goodbye to Rosa, who gave me a short nod that communicated more warmth than most people pack into a full speech. Eric was on the closing shift that last morning. As I was gathering my things, he said, "Good luck." I said, "You too." And that was it. 8 months of shared space and the quiet war over who got credit for a frozen block of waffle batter, and the closing line was 2 people who had learned to be honest with each other through the most indirect route available, wishing each other luck. I think about that hotel sometimes. I think about the particular silence of a lobby at 3 in the morning, and the way the coffee station always needed wiping, and 5 past 5 with the freezer waiting in the back. I think, you don't need to announce what you do. You just need to know what stops happening when you stop doing it. The lesson is not that you should let people fail. It is not that withholding information is a power move worth celebrating. The lesson is narrower and more specific, and I think more useful. It is this: if you are doing work that nobody sees, the person who is benefiting from that invisibility knows. They might not say so, they might not acknowledge it even to themselves in any clear way, but they know. And the proof is in what happens when you stop. Eric didn't panic when the batter wasn't pulled because he hadn't noticed I was doing the reminding. He panicked because on some level he had always known I was doing the reminding, and he had bet that I would keep doing it, and he had bet wrong. I am not going to tell you to go engineer situations where your coworkers fail. That is not sustainable, and it is not particularly healthy, and most of the time the collateral lands on you as much as anyone else. What I am going to tell you is this: know what you are contributing. Know it clearly, specifically, down to the time of night when you contribute it. Not for the purposes of leverage, though apparently it has its uses. Know it because people who don't know what they contribute are very easy to make invisible. And if someone tells your manager that you're the forgetful one, well, you have options. That is all. If this story landed for you, you know what to do. Subscribe, leave a comment, tell me about the Eric in your life, because I am confident they exist and I would genuinely like to hear about them. I will see you in the next one.